Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Friday, and that means it's time for ShakeTube 2017, an informal Shakespeare read-along that's hosted by Curtis at Curtis Books and Films and Lukash over at his channel, in which we every week read a Shakespeare play and discuss it just a bit in separate videos. So it combines the the sociability of a book club with the introversion of BookTube, where we don't actually have to deal with each other. Instead, what you get on Friday is a bounty of great videos of people who've just read or reread a Shakespeare play and are willing to talk about it. And the play this time around, this is episode 3, and the play this time around is Romeo and Juliet, uh, which is, a marquee Shakespeare play. It's Richard III. People tend to know the opening monologue and nothing else, and but Romeo and Juliet is universal. It's a universal currency. The story of, as I'm sure you know, the story of two star-crossed lovers who are these teenagers passionately in love with each other, whose love is doomed by the ongoing feud between their families. And uh, unlike the plays that we've seen so far in Shakespeare, I think for the first time, this play was written probably in the mid 1590s, and for the first time in this play, we see that bugaboo of Western literature, that thing that has irritated me more than anything else, the genius of Shakespeare. It's in Romeo and Juliet that we, I think, first see that genius absolutely stretch its legs, mainly in the absolutely gorgeous language of the play, the absolutely gorgeous compact language of the play, how beautiful and thought provoking and quotable it is in almost every part, in almost every scene. In Richard III, the only beautifully written character is Richard III. And he's also the only character in the round. There are a couple of the secondary characters who feel human from moment to moment. But in Romeo and Juliet, every character is like that. It's actually incredible. With only a couple of exceptions, but all the major characters and most of the minor characters are people, and yet at the same time that they're recognizable people, flawed, three-dimensional people who know each other as if we're looking into their world. They're not playing to us anymore. It's like they're talking to each other. Not only are they that, but when they open their mouths, some of the most gorgeous verse that the English language had yet seen comes spilling out on a regular basis. I think every time I reread it, I'm overjoyed to do so because it's so astonishing. It's the first appearance in Shakespeare's oeuvre of something freaky. It's the first appearance in his plays of a voice and a mind that you're reading. If you're reading along, say you were taking collected Shakespeare as just a book with chapters, and you're reading along just straight from beginning to end, this is the first place in that book where you would say, oh, okay, I've never read anything like that before, and no one else has either. And it's only going to get better from there on out. But Romeo and Juliet, rereading it this time, I was struck by that fact, and the genius of the play shows itself in one other way too, which might not be immediately obvious. The genius of a construction, of a fictional construction. One of the ways that you can tell that it's a genius construction is that you can change almost everything about it and it still works. You can, and people will. They'll be drawn to do just that. Romeo and Juliet has been picked and petted and fluffed and chopped and moved around from the very beginning. In fact, the textual history of the play is a nightmare. So we don't even know what Shakespeare was doing. It's entirely possible that from his own pen there were many versions of this play, totally adapted for the moment or for the company or for the mood. And certainly after that, after the play, first appeared, the two major editions, then reprints and reprints. After that, almost immediately, people started changing it. Actors, theatrical impresarios, producers, directors started adapting it and changing it, making alterations, either to shorten or to lengthen it, to enhance some things and downplay others. and yet the play's magic works. The reason that they did those things rather than simply make a new play is because the basic bare bones skeletal structure of Romeo and Juliet is so sound that it can take almost any amount of alteration. And in theatrical history, I mean, you've probably seen a movie version of Romeo and Juliet, either the famous Franco Zeffirelli version, that's so lavish and lush as is his way, or Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet, which is set in Southern California and has guns and gang violence and gang tattoos, and which I think is brilliant, even though the Romeo and the Juliet are horrible. You've got a talented actress, Claire Danes, who just cannot do. She has no idea what she's doing. And you have an absolutely talentless actor. Leonardo DiCaprio has never given a good performance on screen in his entire career. He's a multimillionaire. And it's bad enough when the director of some movie that he's in is only requiring him to smoke and butcher dialogue, or in the case of the movie that finally won him the Oscar, to mainly grunt and drool. It's bad enough when a director asks him to do that, but when a director asks him to do Shakespeare, it's almost as funny as if you'd done it with trained dogs. But even so, I think the movie is brilliant for the propulsion of it. Watching it in the theater, I remember thinking, God Almighty, this is a gift to every English teacher in every high school in the world. There's not a teenager in the world who wouldn't watch this and who wouldn't understand immediately while they're watching it why it matters, what the drama is here. Though you've probably seen one of those two movies, but the big adaptation of Romeo and Juliet is actually very old. It's the great actor and theatrical producer David Garrick did an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet at Drury Lane that ran forever. it debuted in, I think, 1748, and it just kept going year after year, decade after decade, and only rang down the curtain on its life in 1776. That's a long time later. But even that length of production is nothing compared to the shadow that it cast after that, because Garrick's version of Romeo and Juliet was still the go-to version for theater companies in England and America and all over the world for 100 years after that. It's still, you have a performance that's that successful, it's going to leave a genetic imprint on the collective consciousness of the thing forever afterwards. I firmly believe that if you were to go to even a bookish friend who let's say doesn't have a thorough textual familiarity with Romeo and Juliet, and you were to sit them down and get them talking about the play, I firmly believe that it would be Garrick's Romeo and Juliet that they were talking about, even though they'd never heard of him, certainly have never seen his performance, and would certainly say they're talking about Shakespeare. And one of the reasons that Garrick's production was so successful, and he adapted earlier adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, he didn't invent all that much on his own, but one of the reasons it was so successful is one of the things that some bardolaters don't want to admit, which is that there are flaws in Romeo and Juliet. In the couple of original early 1590s versions that we have, there are flaws. And it behooves you as a theatrical director and someone who wants to put butts in seats to fix those flaws. One of the flaws, of course, is that we're told in the prologue, and it's made a big deal of by everybody, that these two star-crossed lovers are the horrible, innocent victims of the undying enmity of their two families. But we don't see the enmity. We don't see the enmity at all. When old Capulet is having a big ball in his mansion and sees Romeo in the crowd, Romeo is pointed out to him and identified. He says, "Oh, that's fine. I wouldn't disrespect him for all the world. I hear he's a very nice guy." and the same thing is true in the other direction. The feud between the Montagues and the Capulets doesn't seem active. It only has to be goosed up with homicide later on in the play, but it certainly doesn't seem like a major factor. And there's a gigantic dramatic problem at the end of the play. You'll know it. You'll know what I'm talking about right away. at the end of the play, you know the outline of the plot, of course. Romeo and Juliet cannot love. They marry in secret, but there's no peace for them. There's no chance that their marriage will succeed. They can't do it. It can't be public. It's increasing the enmity between their families rather than calming it. And Juliet takes a potion that puts her in suspended animation that looks like death. Romeo thinks she's dead and takes poison down in the tomb. It's a masterful setting. And in the Shakespeare play, he dies. And then Juliet wakes up and sees him dead. And there's no more poison, so she stabs herself. And one of the earliest changes that these dramatic impresarios, and especially David Garrick, made to that ending is to improve on it in the obvious way. The way that didn't occur to Shakespeare, but that's okay. Even a genius can slip up once in a while. The obvious way to improve that moment is the way that Baz Luhrmann takes in his movie, which is to have Juliet wake up while Romeo is still alive. For him to realize that she's not dead. And he can't take back the fact that he's just drank poison. For her to realize that he's with her, that the ruse of her death worked, only to have him die right in front of her. That is absolutely wrenching. It's perfect. You shouldn't do a production of Romeo and Juliet that doesn't end that way. And that's come to be viewed as heresy now. You don't improve on Shakespeare. You don't change Shakespeare. Shakespeare is perfect the way Shakespeare is. And as a result, a lot of people that see the play in the theater don't get that moment. And that moment is unbelievably powerful when it's done well. And one of the people who believes wholeheartedly that Shakespeare is perfect and can do no wrong. What's that I'm suddenly smelling? A whiff of stewed cabbage and camphor oil. It's Harold Bloom. He is the presiding brontosaurus that Lukács thought it would be fun to read in connection with Harold Bloom's book Shakespeare: The Invention of the Human. And Harold Bloom has this to say: the varieties of passionate love between the sexes are endlessly Shakespeare's concern. Sexual jealousy finds its most flamboyant artists in Othello and Leontes. But the virtual identity of the torments of love and jealousy is a Shakespearean invention, later refined by Hawthorne and Proust. Shakespeare, more than any other author, has instructed the West in the catastrophes of sexuality and has invented the formula that sexual becomes erotic when crossed by the shadow of death. There had to be one high song of the erotic by Shakespeare, one lyrical and tragicomical pain celebrating an unmixed love and lamenting in its inevitable destruction. Romeo and Juliet is unmatched in Shakespeare and in the world's literature, as a vision uncompromising mutual love that perishes of its own idealism and intensity. I don't have any idea what that means, and neither do you, but it does prove one thing. It's not just in the movie Shakespeare in Love that we're going to be lectured about eroticism by a virgin queen. In any case, I want to urge, as I've tended to do in these ShakeTube episodes of mine, I want to urge you to watch the play as well as read it. And I also urge you, on behalf of Alexander Pope and John Dryden and David Garrick, I also urge you not to be too prissy about watching adaptations that take liberties with Romeo and Juliet. You'll find you enjoy the original play all the more when you do. So if you haven't seen the Franco Zeffirelli version and the Baz Luhrmann version, watch them both. And then once you've done that, the next time a theatrical company anywhere near you puts on Romeo and Juliet, go and see it. But in the meantime, that'll be it for today's ShakeTube, which was Romeo and Juliet. And our next one, next week, is my very favorite Shakespeare play, Julius Caesar. So that'll be up next, and in the meantime, I'll get back to talking about books. Thank you, BookTube.